When I looked over and saw the barrel of that shotgun staring at me out of his window, that's when I realized somebody wants me murdered. Like, this person wants me killed. At that point, your life comes back as like a flash to you. And I just remember thinking, I can't, it's not my time. And I didn't want to go that way.
There's news conferences going on telling people to stay indoors. There's a killer on the loose. So at this point, we know this is something huge. I couldn't believe it. My mom was the sweetest lady that you can think of. It was painful to imagine her dying alone. I thought that I would be by her side, holding her until she took her last breath. But she didn't have that.
This is the worst single perpetrator I've dealt with in my career. 5 murders and 11 attempted murders. To think that anyone could just pull up behind you at any time and kill you, and you just never know it's coming. It's terrifying to think that someone like that is roaming around among us. And I think that is why the detectives went into overdrive to find this guy and find him fast, because we can't let another one happen.
It was August 20th of 2014, and I take the 5 South to work. I start work at 6 a.m., so it was dark. I noticed a vehicle get on with no lights on. So I glanced at the vehicle, thinking to myself, that's odd. And it was a larger vehicle. So I thought to myself, I better keep this person in my view and make sure that I don't hit them or get in their lane. You know, just want to make sure I was driving safely. So I continued my drive. And as soon as I got off, I stopped. There's a stop sign. And I was stopped at the stop sign, and I looked to the left, I looked to the right, and all of a sudden I heard a hiss and a pop, and I felt wet. And I looked down, and I just had blood everywhere on my shirt. And I'm like, where am I bleeding from? Like, where did this come from? I looked around, and I was like, blood? I was like, what? But I didn't feel any pain. I didn't feel anything. So at that point, I turned, and to the back was the vehicle I saw on the freeway. I could only see like the front bumper and his front window. And I saw the barrel of a shotgun. I thought immediately, okay, it's a carjacking. I tried calling 911. I couldn't talk. I don't know what's going on. I heard like 3 to 5 shots, and then like 4 to 5 or maybe more. He was shooting at the back of my car at that time. That's when I realized somebody wants me murdered. Like, this person wants me killed. I kept going over in my mind, like, what have I done to somebody so bad that they want to kill me? I was talking to God the whole time. I was like, okay, now what? Now what do I do? You know, I'm gonna die. I've lost so much blood. And when I looked up, my rosary that hangs from my rearview mirror in my car, it was going from like side to side. I'm like a clock pendulum, like a grandfather clock. And I was like, okay, time's of the essence, like get out. You don't have time to sit here, go. And that's what made me get out of my car. That was the sign. I was running in the street, trying to flag down help, and nobody would help me. I ran to a guard, and I'm like, please, like, help me. He goes, don't worry, we're getting help for you. I felt like I was dying. I couldn't breathe. And this gentleman came and he grabbed me, and he held me. He put pressure on my throat. He was an angel. I told him I have a son. I told him, I said, I can't leave my son. He said, you're gonna be okay. All his positivity and all his words that helped me pull through in that moment. I just remember thinking, I can't, it's not my time. And I didn't want to go that way.
I found this picture in her jewelry box. And I believe this might be her, like her senior portrait from high school in El Salvador. It made me feel happy. You know, this is a memory of her in her youth. My mom was the sweetest lady that you can think of. She was all about her kids and her grandchildren and about church. Faith was everything for my mom. And she lived it. She lived her faith. And she said, you know, when I die, I'm sure that I'm gonna go to heaven. I'm not afraid. He was coming through the San Fernando area, stopped at a light, and he was shot and killed. It was an unsolved murder, and thinking of this person just stopped at a light, going to work early in the morning, like that could be anybody. So they gathered together, they prayed the rosary, they hugged, and they were really trying to console the Morales family. They wanted to make sure that they prayed for him and for his soul to rest. On August 24th, 2014, it was probably 7 in the morning, and my cousin was calling me. And she's kind of hesitant, like to tell me something. And she's like, your mom's been shot. And she's like, I don't know much, but I just know that your mom was shot on her way to church. I was just like shocked. I had no idea what was going on. I was scared. I couldn't believe it. I was just hoping she was still alive. I felt like I just wanted to be near her.
This is Gloria Tovar's car, where she was found shot to death. And of course, the police put the tarp over the car so that passerbys would not see her body inside. It was a very gruesome crime scene. So the first 911 call that morning came from the 12-year-old Franco children at 5:40 a.m., reporting that their parents and sister had been shot. But even as that's occurring, they're hearing over their police radios that another shooting has occurred in a park in Sylmar, which is Michael Planell's. And then a matter of minutes later, 6:48, that Gloria Tovar had been shot. There's 3 shootings in very close geographic proximity in a short period of time involving a shotgun. And in 2 of those, the suspect vehicle was identified as a large gold or tan colored SUV type vehicle. And the bat signal went up. All police agencies were notified. And that's when the animal cruelty detective came forward with his information. Yeah, this is the key video from the dog shooting. You can see the Suburban right in front of the gate and shoots 3 shotgun blasts into that side gate, killing 2 of the dogs and injuring the other. And their tails are wagging while they die. And the next morning, of course, you had the 3 murders. They immediately, of course, suspected and feared that they had a serial killer on the loose. If a murder happens in a small community, everyone knows about it and everyone has a pretty good idea who might be involved. But in Los Angeles, you can just disappear. It's terrifying to think that someone like that is roaming around among us. And I think that is why the detectives went into overdrive to find this guy and find him fast. So we can't let another one happen.
Next thing I remember is waking up, and I was like, what is going on? Like, I'm in a hospital bed. I was still trying to make sense of what had happened. And that's when I reached for my throat and I felt the trach in the feeding tube, and I was like, uh-oh, oh my gosh, I can't talk. Like, it's just air's going and nothing's coming out. So they got a dry erase board because that's how I'd have to communicate. And right away I was like, what happened? Why can't I talk? And they're like, you had throat trauma. And that moment was hard for me because I was like, well, this is temporary, right? And they're like, we don't know yet. And I'm like, what do you mean you don't know? And I'm like, oh my God, I fought for my life. I went through this surgery that I almost didn't survive. And then now you're telling me I may never talk again? I may never be able to tell my son the words of I love you again. And I was even more angry at this person who did this, and then he still was out there. I still was on a lot of pain medication, and my mind was still foggy. There were certain things that were kind of hazy for me. So I just was trying to pull as much as I could from my memory. I had to have a whiteboard to give them a description of the vehicle. But they were so confused because I was drawing the back of the vehicle. And the detective's like, Nicole, he was shooting at the back of your car. But I didn't know. I wasn't sure. And I was like, oh no, you know what? I didn't see the back of the vehicle. I just didn't, because you're right. He never passed me on the freeway. So I just was like, okay, you guys are right. Like, I never saw it. Just disregard anything. It was just so frustrating. But I felt a strength. Like, I have a job to do. I can't sit here and feel sorry for myself and feel pity. I need to get back on my feet. And I need to get this person caught because he's gonna hurt other people.
When we got to the scene, there was a couple of police officers that had already closed off the area. And I asked, can we get close? Can I touch her? And they said no. I remember that the person that actually called the police about the shooting came up to us, and he said, is that your mom? And we said, yeah, that's our mom. And he's like, you don't want to look. You don't want to remember your mom that way. It's bad. It was painful to imagine her dying alone without anybody near her. I thought that I would be by her side, holding her, with her family surrounding her until she took her last breath. But she didn't have that. She died alone in her car. Seeing our dad that way was horrible. He's like, that's my wife. I want to be near her. I need to protect her. And help me and my brother. I'm stuff like that. You need to calm down. You can't get close. He wasn't going to see her again. He wasn't going to hold her again. None of us would. And my father told the detectives that interviewed us, I put God's eyes in your hands for you to be able to find the person that did this to my wife. God's gonna show you who did this to her. And you're gonna find that person.
On Sunday morning, with 3 murders in the news within an hour in very close proximity, the police were under enormous pressure to find the true perpetrator and get them in custody. A shotgun is not a weapon used in a lot of crimes. Most of the murders in Los Angeles and the shootings involve handguns. So it looked right off the bat like we had a really strong MO between those cases. And that's a lot of shootings for one person to be committing. He gives his name. He says, my name is Alex. And then Alex says, can you help me go get gas for my car? And they drive him to his home, which is a very short distance away, where he gets a gas can, they take him to get gas, and bring him back to his Suburban. So they knew what his Suburban looked like, they knew his name, and they knew where he lived. The detectives drove over and they saw the Suburban parked behind the gate of that house. They immediately put surveillance on that residence. It was surrounded front and rear by SWAT, and they had helicopters surveilling the property immediately. All of Mr. Hernandez's family members came out of the house. He did not come. He stayed in the house, and he stayed in the yard. The helicopter surveillance officers observed him, as they describe it, crawling like with his arms and stomach on the ground, as if to stay low and out of sight. He jumped over the brick wall onto the neighbor's property, into their yard. But there were 2 SWAT officers stationed there, and they grabbed him immediately when he jumped over the wall. He had the shotgun in his hands. It was loaded, and he threw it down when he saw them, and they apprehended him. But he did not surrender quietly. He fought the police, and they tasered him. And after that, he was taken to the hospital to be checked to make sure he was okay after being tasered. I think the circumstances of his arrest tell us a lot about what he was thinking and what his plans were. He's carrying a loaded shotgun. He has extra shot shell in his pockets, and he's got a backpack with all his identification, his car keys, his passport, his birth certificate. We did as much research as we could on Mr. Hernandez, and all I can tell you is there's nothing remarkable there. He had been to prison before, and he had those prior convictions, but they were not violent crimes. He wasn't shooting at people. He had guns. He had prior convictions for possessing firearms. He had some prior convictions for drugs. nothing that foreshadowed these events. He had a family that lived in that home. By all accounts, nice people. There was nothing in his history, nothing in his past, and nothing in his present that would give you any indication that he's a serial killer. But I think even a very basic review of the facts of the 3 murders that occurred Sunday morning would lead any reasonable person to strongly believe that those were related. But we also knew that the vehicle was being processed and that they were looking at potential firearms evidence. And they were still processing the evidence. Particularly things like forensic evidence and DNA can't be processed overnight. It takes time. But you have 48 hours to file charges. Once you arrest someone, it has to be done within that time period or they get released. And obviously there was a great concern that Mr. Hernandez not be released, that would be a terrible danger to the public.
Once my mom was picked up from the crime scene, we all gathered at my parents' house. And I went in one of the bedrooms where she would keep all her clothes and stuff. And I just picked up one of her garments and I smelled it. And it smelled like her. And it just, I couldn't believe she was gone. Later, we found out that there was a series of killings that morning, and my mom was not the only one. And that there had been 2 more shootings in the area, not so far from where my mom was shot and killed. There's news conferences going on, telling people to stay indoors. There's a killer on the loose. So at this point, we know this is something huge. I remember watching when they had his house surrounded and seeing him get taken in that ambulance and getting arrested. We were all in my parents' living room watching the news. It helps them. We knew that the person that had done this was caught and wasn't going to do that again to somebody else. Like, who does that? It's unimaginable, and I was just relieved that he was off the streets. And that part of our story was closed, but we had a long way to go.
I remember the lead detective telling me, "Kiddo, we got him." I was in the hospital. And I said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "No, no, no, no. You swear to me." Like, I was in disbelief that they caught him that fast. I kept asking God, please keep giving me signs along the way that we're on the right path and that we're gonna get justice and he's gonna be off the streets. He's not gonna hurt anyone again. My family will be safe. I can go home and sleep well at night. And it just, all my prayers kept getting answered. I knew I needed to give the police some type of identification for the vehicle. But 2 months. 2 months I did not have my voice. I'll never forget the last time I went to my throat doctor and he's like, "Okay, I'm gonna take the trach out. You ready? This is your big day." And I'm like, "I got this. I'm gonna do this." And he goes, "Okay, I'm gonna pull the trach out." He goes, "Say E." And I said, "E." "Say I." And he was like, "You can talk." And I said, "Yes, I can." I wanted to be able to speak to the detectives. The detectives came to the house and they had maps. "This is your route to work. This is your exit." He kept saying, "The only thing we don't know, Nicole, is what happened on the freeway." And I said, his lights being off drew my attention. So I kept sizing up the vehicle. Okay, it's a larger vehicle. It's a Suburban or a Yukon. but they're way behind me. And they're like, no, Nicole, you saw the back. You saw it. You told us about it. Now I need you to remember. And it clicked, like a light bulb went off. Oh my God, I started crying and I felt my mind being more clear. I could remember more. I walked up to this man's vehicle. After he tried to murder me, that's how I saw the back of his vehicle. That was traumatic. But I guess mentally your mind suppresses things. They did end up eventually pulling the video from the location I was shot in. Okay, so this is when he's following closely behind me. He's in the Suburban. And I'm getting out of the car. I walked up to his vehicle, the passenger side. I couldn't talk completely. I was gurgling and I was very angry. And I went up to his window. I was like, who are you? Why are you doing this? And it was just this dark, empty, blank stare. Nothing. Why he didn't shoot me then, I don't know. So at this point of the video, I'm knocking on the windows. I'm trying to get help and people are just speeding away from me. And I tried to beg and plead with people, please, please help me. And everyone was like, no, I ain't getting involved. I'm not gonna help you. Go to hell, whatever, I don't know. They wanted nothing to do with it. And I just, like I said, I felt disgusted. I felt hopeless. I felt defeated. I can't even breathe. Still hard for you to watch? I literally threw myself on the side of her car and I'm like, please help me. And she said no. How could she not help me? And when I saw that other gentleman that came and helped me, I hope I can find out who that person is and reach out to that person and tell him thank you. Because he didn't have to do that. And I've been truly grateful to you for giving me more time with my family and my friends and my life. And what you did was, it saved my life. It helped save my life. I didn't know how everything came together. I was kept in the dark about that. But they were saying it was a serial killer. And that's when it hit me, like, oh my God, there's more people probably before me, like this guy. That word serial killer was so impactful to me, like, oh my God, a serial killer tried to kill me. I know what I had to do. I had to testify and I had to get justice. He took away my voice, but my voice is here and he's gonna hear it.
Once the evidence suggested that he was a serial killer, then you have to examine, and I think it's a natural question, when did this start? How many more are we gonna find? It was the detectives at LAPD Robbery Homicide Division that started piecing it together. They looked at not just every shotgun shooting, but they started to look at potential handgun shootings too. And we eventually added multiple victims that stretched back 6 months. It included multiple people who'd been shot by Mr. Hernandez. starting with Sergio Sanchez, whose murder was completely unsolved, who was found dead in his car on a freeway with really almost no evidence except one sparse clue, a tip from a truck driver who saw a big gold SUV. The next one was another shooting, a gentleman named Mario Gamboa. Mario was driving on the freeway late at night. He noticed a large SUV following him down the 5 freeway. Again, this is the Suburban, pulled up behind him and fired multiple handgun rounds into his car, and one of them struck him in the back. And he ran away and hid, actually. The third was a man named Luis Valdez. And Luis Valdez had gone out for the evening and came home late. And he didn't want to wake his father, who he shared an apartment with. So he was going to park outside the apartment complex and sleep in his car until morning. And the next thing he knows, he is awakened by multiple shots being fired into his car. And he awakens, obviously in horror. He looks up and he sees this large gold SUV next to him. He ended up being transported to the hospital and treated for multiple gunshot wounds. And the other key shooting was the shooting of Julian Archer. Julian Archer was a young man who was bringing his girlfriend home from prom, and he dropped her off and drove away from her house and was driving home when a large truck pulled up next to him, and he fired multiple rounds into his car with a handgun. Julian Archer was shot multiple times in the back. It damaged his spine. He managed to call 911 himself before he passed out from his injuries in his car.
911 emergency, I've heard a 656.
I've been shot. Look at him on Mail and Corbin. I've been shot like 4 times.
Mail and Corbin?
As it turns out, the home that Julian Archer drove by just blocks before he was shot was the home of defendant Hernandez's girlfriend. And they interviewed her father. Says, yeah, I did hear shots last night. I was awake because my daughter was here with her boyfriend and they were having an argument. And after my daughter came in the house, he drove away, and a few minutes later I heard shots coming from that direction. That was Mr. Hernandez leaving that scene, and Julian Archer ultimately identified him in a photographic lineup. The Suburban was the critical piece of evidence. When they get it to the crime lab and do a very close examination with bright lights, that's when they start finding the blood and tissue, and swabbed hundreds of places in that car. It was under the engine compartment. It was in the wheel well. It was inside his car on the passenger seat because the window was open. So the Suburban was a gold mine of evidence. Over the first 2 years of the case. He was charged with 32 counts.
It was an emotional roller coaster every time something came up. You go through the same feelings, you open up Pandora's box for yourself. My mom's brain matter was found in his engine, and different parts of her DNA were in there. In my mind, that's telling me God had to have a hand in that. I feel that God ensured that there was something that would trace him back to her. She was murdered in a heinous way. She was taken from us. He had no sense of humanity. These human beings, these loved ones that we lost, meant nothing. It was like he was just a hunter and they were his prey. But somebody like that, he doesn't need a slap on the wrist. He needs to be put away for as many years as possible.
So this is the rosary I was speaking about that hung in my car when I got shot. When I saw my car before it was destroyed, I cried because there it was, waiting for me to get it. So I went and got a new car when I was able to go back to work, and my son and I hung it together on the rearview mirror, and I took a picture of us hanging it together. It drives me to work every day. Every time I am in my car, this is guiding my way, watching over me like it did that morning. After I testified, Morales' sister grabbed me when I came off the stand, and I didn't know who she was, and she said, "You're my brother's voice. You're gonna help get justice for us." And she hugged me, and she said, "Thank you." My heart aches for them. I feel guilt because they're not here anymore. There was a lot of loss, and I felt that when I had dark moments and I had dark times that they weren't here to speak and say what they felt or saw or what their fight was or how they felt. So no matter what fears I had or if I had good or bad days, I had to keep going forward. And I'm just glad that the pain I felt, the suffering I felt, that it went to providing some type of documentation for tying this guy to these crimes, because now justice is served.
The sentence in this case was 5 consecutive terms of life without the possibility of parole, and in addition to and consecutive to that, upwards of 400 years in prison. The thing is, even in prison, he gets to get visits from his family, write and receive letters, read the newspaper, watch the news, watch TV, see his kids grow up. The families of the victims don't get that for their deceased victims. They don't ever get it again. This case means more to me than any other case that I've handled because of the absolute innocence of the victims and the way they were so randomly targeted in a way that makes no sense and doesn't have any justification. It's very personal when you go through the process for this many years with these victims. It's personal in the sense that I really care about them. I told those victims that I will have this case and I will watch over this case for the rest of my life. And I will. Because they deserve it.
I think my mother would forgive him. I do. And I think my mother would even pray for him to get forgiveness. That's just the person that she was. I miss her every day. I feel that even though I've built strength, I have times where I fall apart, where I wish she was here because I know that she would help me so much. In the past year, my husband got very, very sick, and he's battling cancer right now. And that's been really hard to go through without her. Because I know that she would be here to help me. I know that she would have been there with him as well. I hope that people understand who she was and the person that we lost. Don't wait till tomorrow. Don't say I'll do it next time or we'll gather another time. Because you never know. You don't know if that person is going to be there. And be thankful for every day that you have, that you get to wake up and to be able to share that with your family.
It starts with a smell no one could explain. Not strong enough to trigger alarm. Not sharp enough to send anyone running. Just a faint, sour note in the air. Something that didn't belong. Something that lingered in the back of the throat and refused to leave. People noticed it in passing, shrugged it off, blamed it on heat, on trash, on something dead out in the fields. Texas summers do that. They rot things fast. They hide things even faster. But this wasn't out in the fields. This was right in the middle of everything. June 2003. A quiet stretch of road outside a small Texas town where nothing ever really happened. Not the kind of place that makes headlines. Not the kind of place where people lock their doors before dark. Front yards bled into sidewalks, sidewalks into parking lots, and everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. It was the kind of place where a missing dog would bring out half the neighborhood, where a broken streetlight would be discussed over coffee like it mattered. So when she disappeared, it didn't make sense. 26 years old. Routine life. Predictable schedule. The kind of person who texts back, who shows up on time, who doesn't just vanish without leaving a ripple behind. Her name started circulating within hours, whispered first, then spoken louder, then repeated with a kind of urgency that spreads like static through a small town. Missing. Not answering calls. Car still parked. Phone left behind. No signs of a struggle. No signs of anything. That's what made it worse. Because when something breaks violently, you can point to it. You can trace the damage. You can follow the cracks. But when someone simply disappears, clean, silent, without disruption, it leaves a different kind of wound. One that doesn't bleed. One that just stays open. The first 24 hours moved fast. Family, then friends, then police. Questions layered on questions. When was the last time anyone saw her? Who was she with? What did she say? What did she wear? Every detail suddenly mattered, every minute re-examined under a microscope of fear. But nothing stood out. Nothing unusual. Nothing urgent. Nothing that screamed danger. And yet she was gone. By the second day, the tone shifted. This wasn't a late-night detour. This wasn't a spontaneous trip. This was something else. Search teams spread out, combing through nearby areas, ditches, wooded patches, abandoned lots. Volunteers joined in. Flyers went up. Her face, frozen in a photograph, stared out from telephone poles and storefront windows. Missing. The word started to feel heavier each time it was said. Neighbors began to talk. Quietly at first. Then with more certainty. Someone mentioned a strange car seen idling too long. Someone else recalled hearing something, a noise, maybe a shout, maybe just imagination dressed up as memory. In cases like this, memory becomes unreliable. It bends. It fills gaps. It tries to make sense of something that refuses to make sense. The police followed every lead. And every lead went nowhere. Days turned into weeks. Weeks stretched into months. The search scaled back. The flyers faded under sun and rain. The town tried to return to normal, but normal had shifted. There was a shadow now. A question that hung over everything. What happened to her? The case cooled. That's what they call it. A cold case. As if time itself lowers the temperature, numbs the urgency, slows the pulse. But for the people closest to her, nothing cooled. Nothing slowed. Every day without answers only sharpened the absence. And then there was the smell. It never fully went away. It drifted in and out, subtle, easy to ignore, easy to dismiss. People adapted. Humans are good at that, adjusting to discomfort until it becomes background noise. Someone would wrinkle their nose, make a comment, then move on. Life continued. Cars drove past. Kids played outside. Doors opened and closed. All of it happening just feet away. Feet away from something no one could see. Years passed. The case file thickened with paper, but thinned with hope. Detectives changed. Leads dried up. The name that once echoed through the town became something quieter, something spoken less often, like saying it too loudly might reopen something people had learned to live with. But not everyone let it go. One detective, years later, long after the original investigation had stalled, picked it up again. Not because of a new lead. Not because of new evidence. Just a feeling. A detail that didn't sit right. Something small, almost invisible in the noise of everything else. The timeline. There was a gap. A narrow window where no one could account for a certain stretch of time. Not enough to raise alarms back then, but enough years later to raise questions. And questions are dangerous things in cold cases. They reopen doors that were closed for a reason. He went back to the beginning. Walked the same streets. Knocked on the same doors. Spoke to people who had long since stopped expecting to be asked anything. Time had changed them. Memories had faded. But sometimes with enough pressure, something surfaces. A detail. A hesitation. A contradiction. One neighbor remembered the smell differently. Not just a passing odor. Not something faint. Something stronger. Something that lingered near a specific place. A strip of land everyone passed, but no one really noticed. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't remote. It was right there, exposed, ordinary, forgettable. Plain sight. The detective stood there for a long time. Looking at nothing. Or maybe looking at everything. Because sometimes the biggest mistake in an investigation isn't missing what's hidden. It's overlooking what's right in front of you. The ground had been disturbed once, years ago. Not dramatically. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough to blend in with everything else, construction, maintenance, the constant small changes that reshape a town without anyone really noticing. He called it in. At first, there was resistance. Resources are limited. Old cases don't always justify new digs, literally. But persistence has a way of wearing people down. And something about this felt different. Not solid. Not certain. But heavy. They brought in equipment. Marked the area. Started digging. The first few feet revealed nothing. Just dirt. Layers of it. Compact, dry, unremarkable. The kind of soil that tells no stories. The kind that keeps secrets. Then something changed. A texture. A color. A disruption in the pattern. The digging slowed. Careful now. Measured. Because once you cross that line from possibility to discovery, everything shifts. Every movement matters. Every second stretches. And then they found it. Not immediately recognizable. Not at first glance. Just something that didn't belong. Something that shouldn't have been there. The smell came back. Stronger this time. Undeniable. After all those years, after all the searches, after all the theories and dead ends and fading hope, it was here. Right here. Exactly where people had walked past, driven past, lived beside, day after day after day. Buried in plain sight. The town didn't react all at once. It never does. News spreads unevenly, like cracks in glass. One person hears, then another, then suddenly it's everywhere. Shock. Disbelief. A strange kind of recognition, like something long buried in the back of everyone's mind had finally surfaced. They had been living next to it. All this time. The cold case wasn't cold anymore. But the answers didn't come easily. Because finding a body is one thing. Understanding how it got there, that's something else entirely. And as the investigation reopened, as old names resurfaced and new questions took shape, one truth began to settle over the town like dust. Someone had known. Someone had walked past that spot, day after day, carrying a secret heavy enough to bury, but never fully escape. And now, after years of silence, that silence was breaking. Here's part 2, continuing seamlessly in the same cinematic voice. The ground doesn't give up its secrets willingly. Even after the first discovery, even after the shape beneath the soil begins to take form, there's a resistance, as if time itself is pushing back, as if the years layered on top have weight, have memory, have something to protect. Every inch uncovered feels like an intrusion into something that was never meant to be seen again. The tape goes up. Yellow lines cutting across a place that, just days before, meant nothing to anyone. Cars slow as they pass. People don't stop, not officially, but they look. They always look. Curiosity pulls at them, mixes with something darker, something closer to fear. Because now it's real. Not a rumor. Not a faded flyer. Not a name spoken in past tense with no conclusion attached. Now there is a body, or what's left of one. Forensics moves in with quiet precision. Gloves. Masks. Cameras clicking in measured intervals. No one rushes. This is the part where mistakes cost truth, and truth, after all these years, is fragile. It can be lost again just as easily as it was missed the first time. The soil tells a story, but only if you know how to listen. Layer by layer, they peel it back. Each fragment documented. Each shift in color, each foreign object, each anomaly marked and recorded. It's slow, painfully slow. Hours stretch into a full day, then bleed into another. The sun rises and falls over the same patch of earth, watching as the past is pulled into the present. And then confirmation comes. Not publicly. Not yet. But inside the perimeter, behind the quiet exchange of glances and tightened expressions, they know. The size of the remains. The positioning. The personal effects, small, degraded, but still there, still whispering identity through decay. It's her. Or at least, everything points to her. The missing person. The name that had become a ghost story in its own town. The case that had cooled, settled, nearly disappeared into paperwork and memory. She never left. That realization hits harder than anything else. She never ran. Never vanished into some distant city. Never started over. She had been here the entire time, beneath a surface so ordinary no one thought to question it. Beneath footsteps. Beneath tires. Beneath years of life continuing without her. The news breaks carefully at first. Authorities release a statement, measured, controlled, deliberately vague. Human remains discovered. Investigation ongoing. Possible connection to a long-standing missing person case. But the town doesn't need details. They already know. By nightfall, the name is everywhere again. Spoken louder this time. Heavier. Final in a way it had never been before. Missing becomes found, but not in the way anyone had hoped. Not in the way that brings closure. This is something else. Something colder. Because now there's a new question. Not where is she, but who put her there? And that question spreads faster than anything else. Old suspicions resurface. People who had once been questioned, briefly, inconclusively, find themselves at the center of quiet conversations again. A name mentioned here. A memory there. Someone who acted strange back then. Someone who said something that didn't quite add up. Time has a way of softening edges, but it doesn't erase them completely. Detectives reopen files that haven't been touched in years. Pages that once felt exhausted now carry new weight. Every statement is reread. Every alibi reconsidered. Because the discovery changes everything. What was once speculation is now anchored by a fact that cannot be ignored. She didn't disappear. She was placed. Intentionally. Carefully. Close. That last part matters more than anything. Because burying someone in plain sight isn't just convenience. It's risk. It's proximity. It suggests familiarity, not just with the victim, but with the area, the routines, the blind spots. It suggests someone who knew exactly how much they could get away with. Someone confident. Or desperate. The timeline tightens. That gap the detective noticed, the one that seemed small, almost insignificant, suddenly expands under scrutiny. Minutes become critical. Movements that once seemed harmless now carry potential meaning. A trip that took longer than expected. A stop that wasn't explained. A phone call that ended too abruptly. And then there's the location itself. Records show minor work done there shortly after her disappearance. Nothing major. Nothing that raised flags. Routine maintenance. The kind of thing that happens all the time, logged, filed, forgotten. But now, in this context, it becomes something else entirely. An opportunity. Someone had access. Someone had reason to be there. Someone could have done it without drawing attention. Names start to align with that possibility. Quietly at first. Then with increasing clarity. Interviews begin again. This time, the tone is different. There's an edge now. A weight behind every question. Because this isn't a missing person case anymore. This is a homicide investigation with a body, a location, and a growing sense that the answer has been sitting just out of reach for years. People react differently when time has passed. Some are defensive. Some are cooperative. Some seem almost relieved, as if the reopening of the case releases something they've been carrying, something they never fully acknowledged even to themselves. And then there are those who change their stories, subtly, slightly, but enough to notice. Enough to matter. One interview stands out. A man who had been peripheral before. Not a suspect. Not even a strong person of interest. Just someone in the orbit. Someone who knew her, who had crossed paths, who had been asked questions and answered them without raising alarms. Back then, he was calm. Now he isn't. It's small things at first. A hesitation. A correction. Details that don't line up with what he said years ago. Memory fades, yes, but inconsistencies have patterns. And patterns draw attention. Detectives press gently. Then harder. His timeline shifts. Just enough to create doubt. And doubt, in an investigation like this, is everything. They dig into his background. Not just who he was then, but who he is now. Employment history. Relationships. Behavior changes over time. Anything that might connect him, not just to her, but to that location, that narrow window, that act. A connection appears. Not direct. Not obvious. But real. He had reason to be near that site. He had access. He had time. Still, it's not enough. Not yet. Because suspicion isn't proof, and after all these years, proof is harder to find than ever. Evidence degrades. Witnesses forget. Truth blurs at the edges. Building a case now requires more than just pointing at what fits. It requires something solid, something undeniable. Forensics continues its work. The remains are analyzed with technologies that didn't exist back in 2003. Advances in science turn fragments into information. Bone becomes timeline. Trace elements become clues. Even the soil itself is examined, its composition compared, its layers studied for signs of disturbance that can be dated, measured, understood. Every piece adds pressure. And pressure changes people. The man is brought in again. This time, the room feels smaller. The questions sharper. They don't accuse him outright. Not yet. They lay out pieces instead. Facts. Timelines. Possibilities. They watch him react. Watch his eyes, his hands, the subtle shifts that reveal more than words ever could. He denies everything. Of course he does. But denial isn't as clean as it used to be. There are cracks now. Tiny fractures in the story he's been carrying for years. Outside, the town watches. Waits. Feels the tension build again, just like it did back then. But different this time. Stronger. Closer to something real. Conversations grow louder. Speculation sharper. People revisit old memories with new context, seeing things they didn't see before, connecting dots that were once too far apart. The case isn't just reopened. It's alive. And as it moves forward, as more details surface, one realization begins to settle over everything. This wasn't random. It wasn't distant. It was here. It was close. And whoever did it had been living among them all along. Hiding in routine. Blending into normal. Walking the same streets, breathing the same air, carrying the same secret that had finally, after years of silence, started to surface. But not completely. Not yet. Because even with a body, even with a location, even with suspicion tightening like a noose, the truth is still just out of reach. And someone is still holding on to it. Here's part 3, continuing the same uninterrupted cinematic voiceover. The interrogation room doesn't feel like a place built for truth. It feels like a place built for pressure. The walls are too close, the light too flat, the silence too controlled. Outside, the world keeps moving, cars, phones, conversations, but inside, time behaves differently. It stretches. It tightens. Every second becomes a weight pressing down on whoever sits in that chair. And right now, he is sitting in it again. Same man. Same face the detectives have looked at before. But nothing about this moment feels the same. Because back then, there was only absence. A missing person. A gap in the timeline. A suspicion without anchor. Now there is a body. And bodies change everything. The detectives don't rush him. They don't need to. They've learned that speed can ruin pressure. And pressure is what makes people reveal what certainty never could. So they start simple. Facts. Confirmations. Small adjustments to the story he's told before. He answers carefully. Too carefully. Every word measured, every pause controlled. But control is not the same as confidence. And beneath the surface, something is shifting. Not breaking yet, but bending. Outside this room, the case expands. Inside it, it condenses. Everything that once scattered across years, across rumors and dead ends and forgotten leads, now folds into a single point of focus. This moment, this conversation, this man. The detectives bring up the site again. Not directly at first. They circle it, describe it in neutral terms. A location, a discovery, a recovery effort. They watch his reaction more than his answers. That's where truth tends to slip, between intention and instinct. A flicker. That's all it takes. Not enough for certainty, but enough to notice. They continue. The timeline is laid out again. June 2003. The disappearance window. The movements reported. The gaps. The inconsistencies that didn't matter back then, but now sit like fractures under a microscope. He shifts in his seat. Just slightly. But in this room, slight is loud. Outside, the forensic work continues without pause. The remains, once hidden for years, are now revealing layers of information no one had access to before. Modern analysis does not rely on memory or testimony. It relies on structure, chemistry, pattern. It reads what humans miss. And what it begins to suggest is unsettling in its clarity. The burial wasn't rushed. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't the act of panic. It was controlled, deliberate, measured in depth, in placement, in concealment. Someone took time. Someone returned to normal life afterward and continued living in proximity to what they had done. That detail spreads quietly through the investigative team. It changes the profile. This isn't a moment of violence spiraling out of control. This is something sustained, something contained. Back in the interrogation room, the detectives change direction. They don't ask, "Did you do it?" They ask about access, about movement, about familiarity with the area during that time. He hesitates again, longer this time. And in that hesitation, the room tightens further. Because hesitation is not silence. It is computation. It is the mind searching for the safest version of a lie. He gives an answer, but it doesn't land cleanly. There are inconsistencies now that weren't visible years ago. Not because they weren't there, but because there was nothing to attach them to. Now every inconsistency has gravity. Every contradiction has weight. The detectives don't let go. They bring in a new layer. Records, maintenance logs, work schedules, vehicle sightings. Nothing dramatic on its own. But together, they begin to sketch a pattern around the location where she was found. A pattern that overlaps with his known movements during that period. He notices. It shows. A shift in breathing. A brief break in eye contact. The smallest retreat inward, like someone recognizing that the walls are no longer just around the room. They're around the story he has been holding together. Outside, the town is no longer whispering. It is watching. Because word spreads faster now. Not through flyers or official statements, but through phones, through conversations that start with half sentences and end in silence. Everyone understands the direction this is going, even if no one says it out loud. A suspect is forming. Not officially. Not yet. But in the collective mind of a community that once accepted absence and is now being confronted with presence, the shift is already happening. Back in the field, investigators re-examine the site. The soil isn't just dirt anymore. It is a timeline in reverse. Each layer represents a moment of concealment. Each disturbance a decision. And beneath those layers, there is evidence of something else, something subtle but undeniable. Disturbance beyond the initial burial. Signs that the ground was revisited. Not frequently, not carelessly, but enough to suggest awareness. Knowledge. The idea spreads quickly within the investigation team. Whoever did this did not simply act and disappear. They remained close to it. Close enough to monitor it. Close enough to ensure it stayed hidden. That realization changes the emotional weight of everything. Because it means proximity was not accidental. It was maintained. The detectives returned to the interrogation room with that knowledge sitting behind their questions now. The tone shifts again, not louder, not harsher, but more precise. Less room for escape. They present the overlap. His presence in the area. The timing. The access. The burial site. Not as accusation. As alignment. And alignment is more dangerous than accusation. Because it removes noise. It removes distraction. It leaves only structure. He goes quiet. Longer this time. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. it feels occupied. The room doesn't move. Even the air feels still. When he finally speaks, his voice is different. Lower. Slower. Not confident, but no longer fully controlled either. Something is slipping, not all at once, but in fragments. He denies involvement. But the denial doesn't extend outward anymore. It turns inward, as if he is no longer trying to convince them, but himself. And that is the moment the detectives notice most. Because truth, in cases like this, rarely arrives as confession. It arrives as fracture. Outside, the sun sets over the town again. The same streets, the same houses, the same routines continuing without interruption. But nothing feels the same anymore. Because beneath everything ordinary, something extraordinary has been uncovered. A person who was missing was never missing at all. She was here, all along. And now that she has been found, the only thing left buried is the reason why. Here's part 4, continuing the same uninterrupted cinematic voiceover. The room changes when silence takes control. Not the kind of silence that means peace, but the kind that presses inward, that fills every corner until even breathing feels like a decision that has consequences. The fluorescent light above doesn't flicker, but it feels like it might. The air doesn't move, but it feels heavy anyway. He's still sitting there, still not confessing, but something about him has shifted. It's no longer about whether he is calm or nervous. It's about containment, how long a structure can hold when pressure is applied from every direction at once. The detectives know this stage. This is the in-between, where certainty hasn't arrived, but denial has started to erode. They don't raise their voices. They don't need to. The case itself is doing the work now. The discovery, the timeline, the overlap, the burial site that shouldn't exist in theory, but does in reality, anchored in soil that remembers more than people do. Outside the interrogation room, the investigation is no longer fragmented. It is converging. Forensics confirms what the field already suggested. The burial was not random, not temporary, not concealed in haste. It was structured, depth consistent, position deliberate. The body was placed, not discarded. The difference is subtle in language, but absolute in meaning. Place means intention. Intention means presence. Presence means someone stayed close enough to decide. And that realization ripples outward through every part of the case. The detectives return to records again. This time with narrower focus. Not everyone connected to her. Not everyone in the area. Only those who intersected with both her timeline and the geography of that location. The list shrinks. Then shrinks again. Patterns emerge where before there was noise. Names that once felt irrelevant now sit at the center of overlapping lines. Work schedules, utility access, routine movements that no one questioned in 2003 because there was nothing yet to question. Until now, the man in the interrogation room is shown maps. Not accusations. Maps. Circles of proximity. Overlaps in timing. Routes that align too neatly with what has been discovered. Each piece is presented calmly, almost clinically, but each one removes another layer of ambiguity. He watches. Doesn't interrupt. Doesn't deny immediately anymore. That delay is new. And dangerous. Because denial that pauses is denial that is calculating what it can still survive. Outside, the town is beginning to fracture in a different way. Not emotionally at first. Structurally, people start remembering differently. Events once considered insignificant are now reinterpreted under the weight of discovery. A vehicle parked too long. A figure seen near a lot. A comment made years ago that now feels different in hindsight. Memory is rewriting itself in real time. And in that rewriting, suspicion spreads unevenly. Some people are convinced already. Others resist it. But no one is untouched. Because once a body is found in a place everyone passed every day, innocence becomes harder to maintain. Not individually, but collectively. The illusion of normality breaks down, and in its place comes something more unstable, awareness. Back in the room, the detectives change pace again. They introduce a detail that hasn't been fully emphasized yet. The burial depth. The precision. The effort required to conceal something in soil that resists shaping, especially in heat, especially in conditions where time is limited. This wasn't a shallow act. It required time, physical effort, control. And control is the keyword that now defines everything. The man shifts again, more noticeably this time. The questions become quieter, not louder. More targeted. Less room for escape. They don't ask him to explain everything. They ask him to explain specific intersections, specific moments, specific absences in his own timeline. He answers some, avoids others, corrects himself once. Then again. Each correction is small but cumulative, like cracks forming in glass that still appears intact until suddenly it isn't. The detectives notice something else now. Not just inconsistency, but fatigue. Not physical fatigue. Cognitive. The strain of maintaining alignment between a constructed narrative and an increasingly detailed reality. The mind can only hold so many contradictions before it starts prioritizing survival over coherence. And survival, in an interrogation room like this, often means shifting from denial to partial truth. Outside, the forensic team completes another layer of analysis. Soil displacement patterns suggest multiple points of contact over time. Not frequent, not ritualistic, but enough to imply revisitation. Enough to suggest that whoever buried her may have returned. Not to move her, not to disturb her, but to confirm she remained hidden. That detail changes everything again, because it removes randomness entirely. Now it is not just a crime. It is maintenance. The detectives return with that word unspoken but present in their approach. Maintenance, preservation, control. The idea that someone was not only responsible for what happened, but for ensuring it stayed hidden afterward. They place a final set of records on the table. Work logs, access schedules, a narrow window of time that aligns too precisely with the burial estimate. And then they stop talking. They let the silence do what it always does best. Fill space. Expand pressure. Force reaction. He looks at the documents for a long time. Long enough that the silence stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like confrontation. When he finally speaks, it is not a full denial anymore. It is a correction. A partial one. A shift in framing. Not, I wasn't there, but something closer to. I don't remember it like that. And that distinction changes the air instantly. Because memory is not alibi. Memory is vulnerability. And in a case like this, where years have already erased the edges of truth, memory becomes the most fragile defense left. The detectives exchange a glance. Not triumph. Not yet. But recognition. Because this is how it starts to collapse. Not with confession, but with instability. Outside, night returns again. The same town. The same streets. The same houses still standing exactly where they were in 2003. But the perception of all of it has changed. Because now everyone knows something they were never supposed to know. She never left. And someone made sure she never would be found. Until now. And the closer the truth gets to the surface, the clearer one thing becomes. It was never buried by time. It was buried by choice. Here's part 5, continuing seamlessly in the same cinematic voiceover. The moment, I don't remember it like that, enters the room, everything tightens in a different way. It is not a denial that blocks the investigation. It is a denial that bends under it. Because memory is no longer a safe place to hide. Not when the soil has already spoken. Not when the timeline has already narrowed itself into something precise enough to feel unavoidable. The detectives don't react outwardly. No sudden movement. No shift in tone. They've learned that the smallest emotional response can give the other side something to anchor onto. Instead, they let his words hang there, suspended, fragile, waiting to be tested against everything that has already been confirmed outside this room. And outside this room, the case is no longer just evidence. It is structure. The burial site, once a hidden point on an unremarkable stretch of land, now exists as a reconstructed event in forensic detail. Heat patterns in the soil, compression layers, disturbance signatures that suggest not just a single act, but a sequence of controlled decisions. The body was not simply placed, it was positioned in a way that avoided detection pathways, areas of likely disturbance and natural exposure. Someone understood what they were doing. That thought alone changes the profile again. Not chaos, not panic, precision. Back in the interrogation room, the detectives shift slightly forward. They introduce a new angle. Not accusation. Context. They begin to talk about routine. About patterns of life in 2003. About how easy it is for certain movements to go unnoticed in a small Texas town where familiarity acts as camouflage. They describe how people pass each other daily without truly seeing each other. How absence is only noticed when it becomes permanent. He listens. But now there is something different in the way he listens. Less defensive. More compressed. As if every sentence is narrowing the space he has left to move within his own narrative. Outside, the investigation widens again, but not outward into space, inward into time. Phone records from 2003 are re-examined. Not because they were ignored before, but because they were incomplete in meaning without a physical anchor. Now they are reinterpreted through the lens of discovery. Short calls, missed calls, gaps in communication that once seemed normal now feel charged with possibility. A single timestamp begins to stand out. A window of minutes that aligns too neatly with both last confirmed sightings and estimated burial timing. It is not proof, but it is alignment. And alignment is what builds pressure. The detectives return to the man with that window. They do not ask him directly about it at first. They describe it, slowly, carefully, letting him recognize it before naming it, watching for the reaction that precedes language. There it is again. That pause, longer than before. A fraction of hesitation that doesn't belong to confusion anymore. It belongs to calculation. When he finally responds, his voice is quieter. He challenges the data. Not aggressively. Carefully. As if pushing against it without fully committing to resistance. But the detectives have seen this pattern before. It is not denial anymore. It is repositioning. Adjusting stance so that collapse, if it comes, will not be total. Outside, the town begins to experience something else entirely. Not shock anymore. Not even disbelief. It is reclassification. People begin mentally redrawing the past. Replacing certainty with uncertainty. Replacing normal memories with revised ones. A conversation once forgotten now feels suspicious. A glance once meaningless now feels loaded. The case is no longer just about one person. It is about everything that surrounded her disappearance. And everything that continued after it. Back inside, the interrogation enters a slower phase. Not because it is losing momentum, but because it is reaching a threshold where speed is no longer effective. This is the stage where details matter more than pressure. Where contradictions must be isolated, not overwhelmed. The detectives begin breaking his timeline into fragments. Not the entire day. Not the entire narrative. Fragments. Minutes. Movements. Decisions. Each one examined individually, then placed back into the reconstructed sequence built from forensic evidence. And with each comparison, the gaps become more visible. Not large gaps. Small ones. The kind that would not matter in isolation. But together, they begin to form a pattern of instability. He notices this. It shows in microreactions now. A slight shift in posture. A brief tightening of the jaw. The eyes moving not toward the detectives, but toward the table, toward the documents, toward anything that isn't a direct confrontation. Because direct confrontation is no longer the threat. Coherences. Outside, forensic specialists refine their interpretation of the burial environment. Temperature data suggests a narrow window of environmental stability. Soil composition indicates minimal post-burial disturbance in the immediate years following the act. But subtle surface changes imply occasional external interaction. Not excavation. Not exposure. Observation. Someone had been near it. Close enough to monitor without revealing. That detail spreads through the investigative team with a quiet weight. Because it suggests not only responsibility for the act itself, but sustained awareness afterward. The detectives return to the room with that implication sitting between them. They do not say it directly. They don't need to. Instead, they present something else. A photograph. Not of the victim. Not yet. Of the site. Before and after. The contrast is subtle at first glance. But once seen, it cannot be unseen. The ordinary becoming altered. The invisible becoming significant only in retrospect. He looks at it. Longer this time. And something in his expression shifts. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but inwardly. Like a structure adjusting under load, it was never designed to carry indefinitely. For the first time, he does not immediately respond. He just looks. And in that silence, something changes in the room. Not resolution. Not confession. But proximity. To truth. To collapse. To the moment where memory is no longer enough to protect what actually happened. And outside, the town continues to breathe the same air it always has. But nothing about it feels unchanged anymore. Because somewhere beneath everything familiar, a buried moment is starting to speak louder than the living ever did. Here's part 6, continuing seamlessly in the same cinematic voiceover. The photograph doesn't accuse him. It doesn't need to. It simply exists on the table, silent and irreversible, showing what time tried to erase but never fully managed to destroy. A stretch of land that once meant nothing. Now it means everything. The kind of image that doesn't reveal new information so much as it reorders old information into something unbearable. He keeps looking at it, longer than before. Not because he doesn't understand it, but because understanding it leaves fewer places to stand. The detectives don't interrupt. They've learned that moments like this don't respond to force. They respond to pressure already in motion. The kind of pressure that builds internally, quietly, until it becomes heavier than anything applied from outside. And this room has been building that pressure for a long time. Outside, the case continues to widen in silence. Forensic mapping of the burial site becomes more precise. Soil layers are reconstructed digitally, each stratum assigned a timeline, each disturbance mapped against environmental conditions in 2003. What emerges is not just a burial location, but a behavioral outline of whoever created it. Controlled depth. Minimal disturbance footprint. No unnecessary marks. No signs of haste. It wasn't just concealment. It was discipline. That word begins circulating among the investigators without being spoken out loud in formal reports. Discipline implies presence of mind. It implies planning. It implies the absence of panic at the moment the act was carried out. And that is what unsettles them most. Because panic leaves traces. Discipline does not. Back in the interrogation room, the detectives shift again, not toward confrontation but toward narrowing. They bring up movement patterns, not vague recollections. Specific intersections in time. Where he was. Where he wasn't. What can be verified. What cannot. They lay it out like a grid slowly closing in on a single point, reducing the space where uncertainty can survive. He responds more slowly now. Not defensive. Not aggressive. Careful in a different way. The kind of care that appears when someone realizes every sentence now carries consequences beyond intention. He corrects one detail. Then hesitates before correcting another. And that second hesitation matters more than the correction itself. Because correction means engagement with the structure of the case. Hesitation means awareness of its direction. Outside, the town is no longer reacting in bursts. It is settling into a sustained tension. People don't talk about what happened anymore in the abstract. They talk about where it happened. The geography has become the focus. Streets once ordinary now carry weight. Locations once ignored now feel contaminated by knowledge. And in that shift, memory itself becomes unreliable. Not because it has changed, but because its meaning has changed. Back inside, the detectives introduce something new. Not evidence, not accusation, but reconstruction. A step-by-step narrative built from everything known so far. Not as conclusion, but as model. A version of events assembled from verified points, leaving gaps only where uncertainty still exists. They speak it slowly, deliberately, not asking him to agree, just placing it in the room. A version of reality that exists independently of his control. He listens, and for the first time, his silence feels different. Less like resistance, more like containment. Something inside him is no longer reacting outwardly. It is turning inward. The detectives notice. They adjust again, narrowing the frame further. They introduce a final piece from forensics, something not dramatic on its own, but devastating in context. A trace element profile. Soil signatures that match not just the burial site, but a secondary location nearby. A point of contact. A transfer zone. Evidence that something or someone moved between those spaces during the critical window. It is not direct proof of anything, but it connects movement, and movement connects people. He looks up at that, finally breaking the long focus on the table. And in that moment, something shifts again, not in what he says, but in what he no longer immediately denies. The detectives feel it immediately. This is not surrender. Not yet. But it is the first sign that denial is no longer automatic. Outside, night presses closer again. The same town, under the same sky, carrying a history that no longer feels distant from the present. And beneath it all, the buried location sits unchanged. But its meaning is no longer static. It is active now, expanding, pressing outward through time, and reaching back into the room where everything is beginning to narrow toward a single, unavoidable question. Not what happened, Not where, but how long the truth can remain unspoken when every other layer has already started to give way. Here's part 7, continuing seamlessly in the same cinematic voiceover. The room feels smaller now, not because the walls have moved, but because the space between truth and denial has narrowed to something almost physical. He is no longer reacting to every detail. He is absorbing them. And that shift changes everything. Absorption is not defense. It is processing. It is the mind trying to rebuild a structure that is no longer stable under the weight of what is being presented. Every piece of evidence, every reconstructed timeline, every photograph, every soil analysis, it is no longer external information. It is pressure inside a closed system. The detectives recognize it immediately. They don't accelerate. They don't push harder. They refine. This is the stage where too much force can break the wrong thing. So they stay measured, controlled, precise. Outside this room, the case has begun to take on a shape that investigators rarely see so clearly in cold cases that have lasted this long. Most reopenings are messy, fragmented evidence, degraded memory, incomplete records. But this one, now that the body has been recovered, is beginning to align like something that was always there, just unseen. The burial site is no longer just a location. It is an anchor point. Everything is being pulled back toward it. Forensics now maps not only the immediate soil, but the surrounding environment in 2003 with renewed precision. Traffic patterns, utility logs, construction permits, environmental disturbances that would have gone unnoticed at the time are now being reevaluated as potential indicators of presence and movement. A pattern begins to form, not of randomness, but of overlap. Certain movements coincide with specific time windows. Certain access permissions align with known changes in the area. It is not a confession. It is not even yet a suspect profile. It is convergence. Back in the interrogation room, the detectives introduce a new angle. Not the event itself. Not the burial. But what came before it. They ask about routine behavior in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Where he was. Who he saw. What changed? Not dramatically, not obviously, but subtly, because in cases like this, the lead-up often carries more truth than the moment itself. He responds slowly, carefully reconstructing his own past in real time. But now, something different is happening. He is no longer just answering questions. He is testing them, measuring how each response will be received, adjusting tone, adjusting detail, as if trying to find a version of events that can still survive contact with what is already known. The detectives notice that too, and they shift again. They begin introducing contradictions, not as accusations, but as documented inconsistencies. Statements made years apart, details that don't align, not presented aggressively, but sequentially, like a timeline correcting itself in real time. Each contradiction lands heavier than the last, because each one is not about proving guilt. It is about breaking coherence. Outside, the town's emotional state has changed again. It is no longer shock. It is inevitability. People begin to speak about the case in terms of when rather than if. That subtle shift in language marks something deeper than curiosity. It marks acceptance that the story is moving toward resolution, even if that resolution is not yet visible. But beneath that acceptance, there is discomfort, because resolution does not mean relief. Not in a case like this. Back inside, the detectives bring in another piece. A reconstructed timeline overlay. Not just his movements. Not just hers. But environmental events layered together. Weather conditions. Traffic flow. Known activity in the area. The goal is not to overwhelm him. It is to remove isolation from his narrative. Because isolated narratives are where denial survives. He studies it. Longer this time. And something subtle happens. He stops correcting immediately. Not completely, but selectively. That selectivity is critical. It means he is no longer trying to defend everything. Only parts. And that is the first structural sign of collapse. The detectives lean into that shift. They don't highlight it. They let it exist. They move instead to the burial reconstruction again, but now with additional detail. The angle of entry, the compression of soil layers, the directionality of movement around the site. Every detail reinforces one central conclusion without ever stating it outright. Someone spent time there. Someone returned to normal life afterward. Someone stayed close enough to monitor what they had done. The room goes quiet again. But this silence is different from earlier ones. Earlier silence was resistance. This silence is recognition. Outside, night deepens. The town continues its routine, but the meaning of routine has changed. What once felt stable now feels temporary. Every familiar place carries a second identity now, one that exists beneath the surface of memory. And at the center of all of it is the realization that has been forming slowly, relentlessly, since the moment the ground was first disturbed. This was never about disappearance. It was about concealment. And concealment requires proximity. Inside the interrogation room, the detectives present one final piece for this stage. Not evidence, not accusation, but synthesis. A reconstructed narrative of movement, access, opportunity, and timing that does not name him directly, but leaves fewer and fewer alternative explanations that do not include him in proximity to the critical window. He looks at it for a long time, longer than anything before. And this time, when he speaks, there is no attempt to rebuild the story from the beginning. There is only a single adjustment. A narrowing. A soft correction of one detail that doesn't fully align anymore with what is being shown. And in that correction, something becomes clear. He is no longer holding the entire story together. He is only trying to preserve fragments. And fragments, in the end, are never enough to hold against the weight of everything that is closing in. Here's part 8, continuing in the same cinematic, uninterrupted voiceover style. The moment a story begins to fracture, it stops behaving like a narrative. It starts behaving like evidence. And evidence does not care about coherence. It accumulates. It overlaps. It presses forward even when the person holding it together is no longer fully in control of how it fits. That is where he is now. Not at confession. Not at denial. Somewhere in between, where every sentence has to be carefully chosen not to rebuild the truth, but to delay its arrival. The detectives can see it without needing it spoken. It is in the pauses, the recalibrations, the way his answers no longer move in straight lines, but in small corrections that attempt to keep him aligned with a version of himself that no longer matches the structure of the case around him. Outside, the investigation has entered a different phase entirely. The case file is no longer just a record of events. It is becoming a model of behavior. Forensics, now working with complete excavation data, refines the timeline of burial with increasing precision. Soil stratification reveals not just when the body was placed, but how the environment responded afterward, how pressure settled, how disturbances faded, how the site stabilized into concealment. But there is something else, something subtle. The area was not completely abandoned afterward. There are faint indications of later presence. Not excavation, not tampering, observation. That detail spreads through the investigative team like a quiet shock, because it suggests awareness beyond the act itself. It suggests continued proximity, continued monitoring, the kind of behavior that does not belong to a moment of violence, but to something sustained over time. Back in the interrogation room, the detectives shift again. They move away from reconstruction. They move toward contradiction. They begin isolating statements from earlier interviews, years-old transcripts that now feel like they belong to a different case entirely. Back then, they were static. Now they are unstable. Every sentence is compared against physical evidence, and every mismatch is brought forward not as confrontation, but as comparison. He listens, and for the first time, he stops attempting immediate correction. That absence of correction is louder than any denial, because it means the mental process is no longer about defending a single narrative. It is about deciding which parts can still survive. Outside, the town is no longer just following the case. It is internalizing it. People are reinterpreting their own memories, not because they want to, but because the discovery forces reevaluation. The body was not found in an unknown place. It was found in a place that had always been part of the landscape of everyday life. That realization changes perception permanently. What was once background becomes foreground. What was once invisible becomes unavoidable. Back inside, the detectives introduce something new again. Not a document. Not a photograph. A sequence. A reconstructed movement path based on overlapping data points. Cell activity from limited archival records, vehicle sightings, environmental logs, witness fragments that now align in ways they did not before. It is not perfect. It is not complete. But it is consistent enough to form pressure. And consistency, in an interrogation like this, is more dangerous than certainty. He studies it, longer than before, and something happens that hasn't happened yet in the room. He interrupts. Not aggressively, not emotionally, but structurally. He questions one part of the sequence, then another, not denying the whole thing, but attempting to disassemble its internal logic. The detectives let him, because this is not resistance. This is engagement. And engagement means he is no longer outside the structure of the case. He is inside it. Outside, forensic specialists revisit one specific detail from the excavation. A secondary disturbance layer beneath the primary burial. It is subtle, almost indistinguishable from natural soil shifts. But under controlled analysis, it suggests something unexpected. The ground was not only used for concealment. It was modified, not extensively, but deliberately. A surface-level adjustment that would have reduced visibility from casual observation angles. That detail reframes the entire location again, because it means the site was not just chosen. It was prepared, and preparation implies foresight. Inside the interrogation room, that concept settles without being spoken. Foresight means planning. Planning means intent. Intent means continuity. The detectives introduce one final document for this phase. A consolidated timeline that removes ambiguity wherever possible and highlights only confirmed overlaps between movement, access, and opportunity. They place it in front of him, and then they stop talking. For a long time, no one moves. The air feels denser than before, not because anything physical has changed, but because the structure of uncertainty has thinned to its limit. He looks at the timeline. Not quickly, not defensively, but in a way that suggests he is no longer searching for contradictions in it. He is searching for where he still fits. That search takes time, longer than any answer he has given so far. And when he finally speaks, it is not to correct a detail. It is not to reject the structure. It is something quieter. He acknowledges a portion of it. Not all. Not enough to resolve anything. But enough to confirm that parts of what is shown are no longer separable from what he remembers. And in that moment, something fundamental shifts in the room. Because acknowledgement is not confession. But it is the first point where denial stops being total. And once denial is no longer total, everything else begins to move. Outside, night settles deeper over the town. But the darkness no longer feels like absence. It feels like exposure. Because beneath it, everything that was buried, physically, temporally, psychologically, is starting to align toward the same unavoidable center. And that center is no longer hidden. It is simply not fully spoken yet. Here's part 9, continuing seamlessly in the same cinematic voiceover. Acknowledgement changes the geometry of a room. Not dramatically, not with visible rupture, but in a quieter, more dangerous way, like a structure that has just admitted it is no longer fully stable under its own weight. He has not confessed, but he has stopped resisting everything. And that distinction is now the difference between distance and proximity. The detectives feel it immediately, not as victory, but as transition. This is the point where interrogation stops being about forcing truth out and starts becoming about defining how much truth can still be contained without collapsing the entire narrative at once. Outside this room, the investigation tightens around that same transition. Forensics completes a full reanalysis of the burial site with enhanced layering techniques. What once appeared as a single act of concealment now reveals a sequence of controlled environmental interactions. The soil does not only show disturbance, it shows correction. Subtle adjustments made after the initial burial, almost imperceptible without modern reconstruction tools. That detail spreads quietly through the team. Correction implies return. Return implies awareness. And awareness, in a case like this, is never neutral. It is intent extended over time. Back in the interrogation room, the detectives change tone again. Not softer, not harsher, more precise. They begin focusing on gaps instead of events. The missing pieces in his timeline, the unaccounted minutes, the transitions between known locations that no longer feel seamless under the weight of reconstructed data. He tries to answer, but now his answers are no longer building a story. They're adjusting one. An adjustment is always reactive. The detectives notice something else emerging now. Fatigue is no longer the dominant signal. It has been replaced by constraint. The feeling of being surrounded not by accusation, but by structure, by a version of events that exists independently of his permission. They introduce another element. Witness behavior. Not direct identification. Not naming anyone. Just patterns. People who reported unusual activity near the site after the disappearance. People who noticed movement, but dismissed it at the time because it didn't fit the context. In 2003, it was noise. In 2026, it is pattern. He listens, but his responses are no longer immediate. They are delayed, filtered, as if each answer must pass through multiple internal checkpoints before it is allowed to exist outside of him. Outside, the town is no longer reacting in waves. It is stabilizing into a single sustained state, anticipation. Not of outcome, but of confirmation. People sense that something irreversible is forming. Not speculation anymore. Not theory. Something closer to conclusion, even if no official language has declared it yet. The case has moved beyond mystery. It has become trajectory. Back in the room, the detectives introduce a reconstruction of movement that includes not just the suspect's path, but environmental context, light conditions, traffic flow, human density in the area at the time. The purpose is not to overwhelm. It is to eliminate ambiguity, because ambiguity is where denial survives. He studies it longer than anything so far. And for the first time, he asks for clarification. Not defensively, not evasively, structurally. He wants to understand how a specific overlap was determined, how a gap in visibility was calculated, how a particular movement window was inferred. This is not rejection. It is analysis. And analysis means engagement. The detectives answer. Carefully, because now the conversation is no longer interrogation in the traditional sense. It is joint examination of a collapsing timeline. Outside, forensic reconstruction of the burial sequence reaches its most detailed stage yet. Digital soil modeling suggests not only placement and stabilization, but environmental adaptation over time. Subtle shifts indicating that the site was not only hidden, but preserved against accidental discovery through natural exposure cycles. That finding carries weight beyond technical meaning. It implies anticipation. Someone accounted for the possibility of discovery and acted against it. Back inside, the detectives introduce a final comparative layer. Not accusation, not theory. Comparison between known behavioral patterns of the suspect and the reconstructed actions required at the site. They do not say you did this. They show this is what happened, and then they let the overlap speak for itself. He looks at it, longer than before, and something shifts that has not shifted yet in this process. He stops challenging structure entirely. Instead, he focuses on continuity, trying to reconcile fragments of memory with reconstructed reality. That reconciliation is slow, uneven, incomplete, but it is happening, and that is what matters, because reconciliation is no longer denial, and it is not yet confession. It is the space where truth begins to replace the architecture that once contained it. The detectives wait, not pressing, not retreating, waiting for that space to expand just enough that it can no longer collapse back into denial. Outside, night holds steady over the town. The same streets, the same houses, but nothing about them feels static anymore. Because beneath everything visible, the past is no longer buried in silence. It is reorganizing itself into something that can finally be spoken, if the structure holding it together gives way entirely. Here's part 10, continuing seamlessly in the same cinematic voiceover. The room no longer feels like it is holding an interrogation. It feels like it is holding a transition. Something between what was believed and what is about to be known. He sits still, but it is not the stillness of resistance anymore. It is the stillness of internal movement. Thoughts rearranging themselves under pressure, they can no longer deflect outward. Every detail shown to him, every reconstructed overlap, every corrected fragment of time is no longer an external challenge. It has become internal inventory. The detectives can see it in the way he no longer interrupts. Not because he agrees, but because disagreement no longer feels structurally sustainable. Outside this room, the investigation has entered a phase where everything must now align with what has already been physically recovered. The burial site is no longer an endpoint. It is a reference system. Every new piece of data is measured against it, calibrated against its constraints, checked for consistency with what the soil has already confirmed. Forensics pushes deeper into microanalysis. The layers beneath the body reveal something unexpected in refinement rather than revelation. Not new evidence in the dramatic sense, but subtle confirmation of control. The burial environment shows signs of stabilization techniques, small adjustments to surrounding soil density that reduce surface anomaly detection. It is not something done in panic. It is something done with awareness of being hidden. That awareness changes everything again, because it suggests the act was not isolated in time. It was extended into aftertime. Back in the interrogation room, the detectives shift once more. They do not introduce new evidence immediately. Instead, they revisit something already known, but now with altered context. The last confirmed movements. The final window before disappearance. The overlap between presence and absence. They lay it out again, but this time without gaps, without uncertainty markers, without hesitation in language. What remains is a clean sequence. Too clean. And that cleanliness creates pressure of its own. Because human events are rarely clean unless they have been reconstructed after the fact. He studies it. And for the first time, he does not try to correct it. He tries to integrate it. The detectives notice that shift immediately. Integration is no longer defense. It is reorganization of self within a structure that is no longer negotiable. Outside, the town has reached a strange stillness. Not calm. Not resolution. Suspension. People are no longer debating what happened. They are waiting for official confirmation of what they already feel has been determined. Conversations are shorter. Repetitive. Focused on outcomes rather than speculation. Everything feels like it is converging toward a single point. Back inside, the detectives introduce a new element, not evidence, but consequence. They begin to outline what the timeline implies if it is accepted as reconstructed fact. Not legally, not officially, but structurally. Opportunity windows. Physical presence. Access alignment. Behavioral consistency with concealment. They do not assign guilt. They outline inevitability. He listens, and something in his posture changes again. Not collapse. Not relief, but recognition, as if a pattern he has been circling internally is finally aligning with something outside himself that confirms it. The detectives pause after that, long enough for silence to expand again. And in that silence he speaks. Not a denial, not a correction, a clarification about sequence, a specific moment, a specific action, not the full picture, but a fracture in it. And that fracture matters more than anything before it. Because it is not imposed. It is offered. Outside, forensic reconstruction reaches a point where timing can now be narrowed to a remarkably precise window. Not just day, not just hours, but segments of movement that align almost perfectly with environmental records and limited observational data. The case is no longer vague in time. It is becoming precise. And precision removes distance. Back in the room, the detectives lean into that precision. They do not interrupt his clarification. They refine it. They adjust their notes in real time, aligning his words with existing structure, mapping them against the reconstructed timeline without forcing interpretation. And in doing so, something unusual happens. The structure begins to hold both versions. His version, and the reconstructed one, side by side, not yet merged, but no longer separate. That coexistence is unstable, but it is real. He notices it too, and for a moment, he stops speaking entirely, as if realizing that every word now determines which structure survives longer. Outside, night reaches its deepest point. The town is silent in a way that feels unnatural, not because nothing is happening, but because everything already has, and all that remains is for language to catch up with reality. Inside the interrogation room, the detectives wait again, because now the case is no longer pushing toward discovery. It is pushing toward acknowledgement. An acknowledgement, once fully formed, does not remain contained for long. Here's part 11, continuing seamlessly in the same cinematic voiceover. Acknowledgement doesn't arrive like a confession. It arrives like exhaustion that finally stops pretending to be control. He is quieter now, but it is no longer the silence of resistance or calculation. It is the silence of someone standing too close to a structure that has already begun to define him more accurately than he can define himself. The detectives don't fill the space. They've learned that this stage does not respond to direction. It responds to inevitability. Every document on the table, every reconstructed timeline, every forensic alignment is no longer being used to persuade. It is simply being allowed to exist fully. and existence at this point is enough. Outside this room, the investigation has reached a level of coherence that no longer depends on interpretation. The burial site is now fully mapped, not just physically but temporally. Every layer of soil has been assigned meaning within the sequence of events, every disturbance calibrated against environmental records, every anomaly contextualized within human action. What remains is not uncertainty. It is specificity, and specificity carries its own kind of weight. Forensics confirms again what has become increasingly difficult to separate from fact. The concealment was not only deliberate, but structured to minimize long-term discovery risk. That includes subtle modifications to the surrounding environment that would reduce visual and physical detection over time. Nothing about it suggests randomness. Everything suggests intention extended beyond the initial act. That conclusion circulates quietly through the investigative team, not as speculation, but as consolidation. Back in the interrogation room, the detectives introduce one final reconstructed overlay. Not new evidence, not a new witness, but the full synthesis of everything so far: movement, timing, environmental conditions, access patterns, behavioral consistency, and spatial alignment with the burial site. It is not labeled as accusation. It is presented as convergence. A single system built from multiple verified inputs. He looks at it for a long time. Long enough that the room stops feeling like it contains three people. It feels like it contains only one system of logic. And he is either inside it or outside of reality as it is now being defined. The detectives do not ask him anything. They wait. Because at this point, questions are no longer the instrument. Silence is. He exhales once. Slow. Measured. And for the first time, there is no attempt to reframe, correct, or adjust what has been presented. Instead, there is something simpler. He begins to speak in fragments that are no longer defensive in nature. Not denial, not reconstruction, but placement of himself within certain points of the timeline. Not the entire sequence, not the full admission of events, but specific confirmations of presence, of movement, of proximity to certain windows that have already been defined. Each fragment is small, but each one reduces distance between him and the reconstructed narrative. Outside, the town has entered a state where anticipation has turned into certainty without official language to support it yet. People are no longer asking what happened. They are waiting for what will be confirmed. And that waiting carries its own tension, because it suggests that truth is no longer hidden. It is simply being formalized. Back inside, the detectives listen without interruption. Because now every word is structurally important. Not emotionally. Structurally. Each fragment he offers is immediately placed against the reconstructed timeline, not to challenge it, but to test how it holds under partial alignment. And it holds. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to begin merging two versions of reality that had previously been in conflict. His memory and the reconstruction, neither fully dominant anymore, neither fully separate. And in that overlap, something irreversible begins to form. Not conclusion, not confession, but compatibility. A state where denial can no longer exist without contradiction, and contradiction can no longer be sustained without collapse. He stops again, not because he is being pushed, but because there is nothing left to resist in the same way anymore. The detectives finally speak. Softly, not asking for more, just acknowledging what has already been placed into the room. And in response, he gives something that is no longer shaped like evasion. It is shaped like proximity. A final narrowing of distance between him and the sequence of events that the case has been building toward since the ground was first disturbed. Outside, night begins to loosen. Not because the darkness is ending, but because the pressure it contained is starting to release elsewhere. And in that release, everything that was once buried, physically, temporally, psychologically, moves one step closer to becoming undeniable in spoken form. Here's part 12, final. Continuing seamlessly and bringing the narrative to a cinematic close. There is a point in every cold case where silence stops being protection and starts becoming confirmation. He sits there now in a different way than before. Not collapsed, not broken, not dramatic in any visible sense, but no longer separated from the structure that has been forming around him. It is as if the room is no longer containing a suspect and investigators. It is containing a single version of events that has finally stopped splitting itself in two. The detectives do not rush him. They don't need to. Because what is happening now is not extraction. It is convergence. The final narrowing of everything the investigation has uncovered into a shape that can no longer avoid contact with language. Outside, the case has already crossed that threshold in every other way. Forensics has completed its reconstruction of the burial environment down to the finest measurable detail. The soil is no longer just evidence, it is chronology. Every layer corresponds to a decision point. Every compression line corresponds to movement. Every stabilization pattern corresponds to time spent ensuring the location would not reveal itself naturally. Nothing about it is accidental. Nothing about it is passive. It is a record of control that remained intact long after the act itself. And that record has now become part of the official investigative reality. Inside the interrogation room, the detectives present the final consolidated timeline. Not as theory, not as suggestion, but as the complete alignment of verified data points that have survived every test of contradiction so far. Movement windows, access overlaps, environmental conditions, behavioral consistency, spatial proximity to the burial site, all placed together, all converging. There are no gaps left large enough to hide inside. Only interpretation remains. He looks at it for a long time. Long enough that even the idea of denial stops appearing as an option worth forming. When he speaks, it is no longer in fragments designed to preserve distance. It is in fragments that acknowledge presence. Not full narrative, not full confession, but enough to confirm what the structure has already been saying for some time now. He was there in the critical window. He moved through the space that now defines the center of the case. He cannot separate himself from the timeline without breaking continuity with what is already established as fact. Each statement reduces ambiguity. Each reduction increases clarity. And clarity in this room is irreversible. The detectives still do not interrupt. Because interruption is no longer necessary. What is unfolding is not resistance breaking. It is separation ending. Outside, the town is no longer waiting for news. It is waiting for confirmation of news it already understands without official language. The disappearance that defined years of silence has already transformed into something else in public consciousness. Not absence, not mystery, but outcome without formal declaration. And that declaration is now approaching. Back inside, the detectives allow a final pause. Not for strategy, but for completion. Because there is nothing left in the room that requires pressure to surface. He lowers his gaze. And when he speaks again, it is not to defend a version of himself. It is to place himself within a reality that no longer splits events into possibility and denial. It is partial, but it is no longer avoidant. And that is enough. The case does not end with a dramatic confession. It ends with alignment, a full structural convergence between what was buried in soil and what was buried in time. Outside, the night begins to lift in its own slow way, not through light, but through resolution settling across everything it once concealed. The cold case is no longer cold. It is no longer case in the old sense at all. It is history being finalized. And somewhere beneath the ordinary surface of a Texas town that once carried silence without knowing why, truth is no longer underground. There is no Part 13 in the sense of a new mystery unfolding the same way. Because once truth reaches this point, it stops behaving like a narrative engine and starts behaving like impact. But there is what comes after alignment. The room doesn't feel louder after it ends. It feels emptier. Not because anything has been removed, but because something has finally stopped resisting its own definition. The detectives remain still for a moment longer than necessary, not out of ceremony, but because transition has a weight of its own. You can feel when a case stops being something you pursue and becomes something you document. He is still there, but he is no longer holding the structure of denial together in any meaningful way. There is no performance left in his posture, no attempt to reconstruct distance between himself and the timeline that has been built piece by piece until it became unavoidable. Outside this room, the procedural machine activates in quiet sequence. Statements formalized, timelines locked, forensic conclusions finalized, chain of custody reinforced. Nothing dramatic in its movement. No sudden noise. Just the administrative translation of what has already been understood. Because in real investigations, the turning point is rarely loud. It is procedural. It is written down. It is signed. And in that act of documentation, the case stops being fluid. It becomes fixed. The burial site is now officially reclassified not as a point of search, but as a confirmed origin of concealed remains, with reconstructed causality built from converging evidence streams. Every layer of soil analysis, every spatial reconstruction, every verified timeline fragment now sits in the same structure, no longer competing, no longer provisional. It is all the same story now, just told from different angles. Back in the interrogation room, no one asks him to continue speaking. There is no need to extract more. What has been said is no longer about volume. It is about placement within the record. Even silence at this stage has meaning, because silence is no longer resistance. It is exhaustion of alternatives. One of the detectives finally closes a folder. Not sharply, not theatrically, just enough to mark that the investigative phase in this room has reached its endpoint. And yet nothing about it feels like an ending in the emotional sense. There is no relief that arrives cleanly. There is only the settling of consequence. Outside, the town begins to experience the second wave of understanding. Not discovery. Discovery already happened. This is integration. The moment where people realize the past they lived inside was missing a core truth the entire time, and every memory connected to that space now has to be reinterpreted under new gravity. A road was not just a road. A lot was not just empty space. A routine was not just routine. It was proximity to something unseen. And that realization doesn't fade quickly. It lingers. Back inside, the detectives prepare to leave the room. Standard procedure now replaces interrogation. Formal steps replace dialogue. The human intensity of the room begins to give way to structure again. But before they go, there is one final look at him. Not as a subject, not as a suspect, but as the point where the case transitioned from uncertainty into record. And there is nothing more to extract from that point. Only to archive it. The door opens. The sound is ordinary, which is what makes it final. Because nothing about the truth, once it has fully arrived, needs to announce itself anymore. It simply remains. And in a small Texas town where silence once hid everything, the silence that follows is no longer concealment. It is after.